Because sometimes the concepts don't necessarily get registered for what they really mean in practical terms, in daily living. Whatever the other does is pleasure or pain to you. Whatever they do and the outcome is, if as it relates to you, is only ever pleasure or pain. And how we tend to relate to the other is as if they are responsible for our completeness, as if what they do can somehow make us complete or incomplete. So when we have that relationship to the other, which really means that we see their actions as delivering something that either adds to me or takes away from me, then we have to hate them if they do something that delivers pain to me because it's seen as an attack on who I am. Then that's where the blame comes from, the hate. And the resistance towards the other. So this getting a clear understanding that the flow of life is only ever pleasure or pain. And that what I am, in essence, exists actually prior to the flow of life. That the body is part of the flow of life, and so the flow of life is going to be pleasure or pain on the body. And if we can find the part of us that exists and is actually not the body. Obviously the body is the vehicle. We don't exist separate from the body. But we're not solely the body. If we have an accident, which would be very unfortunate, but we lose an arm, we find we're still here. And then if we lost another arm, I'm still here. And then you lose a leg, so I'm still here. And so the body is not the being. Which is why the principle here is that if we found ourselves in really unfortunate circumstance, and the example I've used, if we find ourselves in a prison for the rest of our life, that's going to be a very painful situation, most probably relative to the freedoms that we have in daily life, especially given that we're above the poverty line and we can, have a roof over our head and food. And this is saying, actually, our happiness is available even if our circumstance has us in a prison for the rest of our life. Because being in a prison means is part of the flow of life, pleasure or pain. So our happiness actually comes from our attitude to the flow of life.
Could you speak a bit about what happened? You mentioned last time when you're not so much involved with what you were before, and you feel that that's not so exciting or not so much in resonance with who you are, but still you're not really like in
on the other side.
Yeah. So you call it, I think, the desert or frustration.
Spiritual desert, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that at some point we realize that some of the activities we took part in just they're seen to be a little bit shallow. And for the time when they seemed fulfilling, that's fine. It made sense that we engaged in them. There was some sort of belief system around how impressing other people maybe was worthwhile, and so we put a lot of effort into impressing other people. Maybe put a lot of effort in going out late at night, very late at night, drinking a lot, and that can still be fun. It's not to say that there's something wrong with that activity, but it depends on the attitude behind it. So at some point we find that we put a lot of effort into certain things, and when light is shone on why we're doing it, and we realize, no, that's never going to give me contentment and fulfillment, then those activities really lose interest, or we lose interest in them. And then friendships can change, because friendships are often based on things we have in common. And so some of our friends that we were doing those things with maybe haven't seen things differently, and so it's time usually for those friendship groups to end, or those friendship connections. Not all of them. Some can be maintained on some other basis, but a lot of them fall away. And if we can look at it without holding on to, thinking that we need to hold on to everything as it is all the time, then friendships can fall away, and it's not seen to be a big problem. It's just part of the fact that there's change. And what we can find is that all of the things that we used to feel supported who we believed we were are now no longer interesting. So we can't engage in them. And yet an inner contentment hasn't been fully delivered yet. And so we find ourselves in this in-between zone where we understand we have to leave that aside, but what takes its place hasn't been delivered. And it's there as part of the process, and the reasoning probably is that a connection to oneself hasn't been fully established, and that connection to oneself hasn't been fully established because even though some of the outward habits that have been seen clearly to be based on some false beliefs, they've been dropped, but there can be several other layers of beliefs about who we are, or attachments, different habits, that still remain in the system. And as those get weaker and weaker, then a connection to being tends to become more and more established. There's also a lot of other reasons. There's in the spiritual desert, in a sense, you tend to find yourself spending a lot of time quietly on your own. So it provides opportunity for contemplation, and it also, as part of the fact that there is this lack of satisfaction to some extent, it triggers these remaining beliefs. So that zone can be quite challenging because it feels a bit empty and flat. But at the same time, when we see what happens while we're in that zone, there's a lot of release and a lot of insight into things that are maybe still suppressed. So if the description resonates, then knowing that it's very much part of the process, knowing that nothing's gone wrong when that happens, can be helpful for that to be in place. Okay, I can relax a little bit knowing that it's sort of like on a road trip, you're following directions, and then you get to a point where you went past the last landmark, and then you're driving and driving and driving, and you're not finding any landmarks. And then at some point you think, have I missed the turnoff, or have I gone too far, and am I just driving and driving and driving? And someone goes, no, there's this part there where you drive and you drive and you drive, and you're convinced that you've got it wrong. And keep on track. That's part of the journey. And just when you think you've totally gone off track, another landmark will turn up. Oh, there, good. There it is.
I totally resonate with it. What is for me different is that I don't find like passion anymore. Like everything is so flat, and I'm just wondering if it's your experience that is really turning like that. That is just flat, or
Yeah. Well, one of the symptoms is sometimes that the concepts can become beliefs, and then the concepts get in the way. They can sort of create the desert-like experience a little bit, and so the concept that happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life, for example, it helps at breaking our identification, our attachment to pleasure. And what tends to happen is that we never really go from one extreme to the middle. We tend to go from one extreme where we're attached to pleasures and then swing to the other side where we, for example, push pleasures away. And so it feels great to break away from this habit of being attached to pleasure. Once we see it, it's like, wow, that's been holding me in a place of uncomfortableness for a long time. And so in a way we rebel against it and go to the other extreme, maybe not as extreme, but on not center. And then that in itself starts to feel, no, there's something wrong in this. It's not balanced, it's not aligned. And so the answer always then is this uncomfortableness. Or lack of contentment, let's say. And then awareness lands on the fact, I've now swung to the other end. And then we find this middle zone. We don't swing back to the other side, or if we do swing back, we don't swing anywhere near as far as where we used to be. And if we're still a little bit off center on the pleasure side, attached to pleasures, then that will feel uncomfortable. And then we swing back and maybe push pleasures away a little bit, and that feels uncomfortable. And eventually, and it doesn't have to be a big process, find that middle ground. So a good example, I think, is someone who is continually controlled when they were young by their parents, let's say. This is how you have to do it, you can't do that, don't make a noise, completely controlled. And at some point, they realize that, no, I can live my life however I like. Let's say even as an adult. Maybe they only realize it when they're an adult. And then what can happen is you see their children are climbing on tables in the restaurants, and they're sitting back. It's freedom, do whatever you want. And they're eating out of people's plates and climbing underneath the tables, and the parents are like, no problem, because they've rebelled against control and swung to the other extreme, which in itself isn't the middle path. So it is important to see whether a new set of beliefs is actually keeping us disconnected from being.
So just one more thing. So in this being, there's everything possible, also a lot of passion, even desire.
Yeah,
but without attachment then.
Yeah. So it depends how you use the word desire, because in Buddha's terminology, well, I don't know if it's Buddha's terminology, it's what I came across as what Buddha had summed up enlightenment to be, and was enlightenment is the end of suffering. The cause of suffering is desire. And so in that sense, when he's using the word desire, he means attachment to pleasure, where we believe that, so effectively what I was speaking of at the beginning of the talk, where we believe that our happiness, our completeness, is dependent on pleasure, and therefore we're obsessed, we have to have it. Because when we don't have it, we feel like there's a part of us missing, because we have a self-image of ourself. And that self-image says, I need these things to be complete. And so in that use of the word, no, there won't be desire, but that means attachment to pleasure. But in the sense of a biological preference for something, then very much so, with the end of attachment, with resting in being, there can very definitely be a desire for one's preferences. So using the word desire differently here. And so Osho, for example, has, it's not a path of renunciation. And there's the Zorba, the Buddha, is the Buddha that is the Buddha of enjoyment and full participation in life. And in Hinduism, the word for an unenlightened person who is attached to pleasure is a bhogi. Bhogi means enjoyer. But then the word mahabhogi, super enjoyer, is used to describe an enlightened being. So the mahabhogi enjoys pleasure fully when it's available, without being attached to the pleasure remaining, knowing that it's part of the flow of life and that our being is not dependent on that. And so what can happen with us if we've got attachment is, even when we're enjoying pleasure, the thought arises and disturbs the enjoyment of the pleasure. The thought, when will this end? What am I going to do when it ends? So when we're on a 10-day holiday, and on day 8 we start worrying about the fact that there's only 2 more days to go before I have to go back to my, everyday life, back to work. And so that thinking can disturb the last 2 days. So the word mahabhogi, super enjoyer, is describing exactly this fact, that once there's freedom from the attachment to pleasure and pain, you can enjoy pleasure fully. And it doesn't mean that we just have to wait for the pleasure to come to us to enjoy it. There can be an urge in the body. You could, just like feeling thirsty, if you feel thirsty, you don't have to wait for someone to bring a drink to you. You can actually go for it. And so thirsty seems like it's a very basic preference arising. But you might have the urge for, caviar one day, something fancy. And then there's nothing stopping you getting in your car and going to a restaurant and ordering it, and they may or may not have it. It may or may not be good. So you've followed the urge and to the best of your ability, and as soon as the outcome, knowing the outcome's not in your control, if the outcome isn't in line with what your expectation is, which is a different expectation, once again, it's not you're not attached to the expectation, then you accept that as the flow of life. But often, if you go to a restaurant, you order what you're really looking forward to, and it's very nice.
Yeah. So that means the indicator, if the pendula is in the middle, is that you have a feeling of contentment and no uncomfortable feeling. Mm-hmm. Is that the indicator?
Yeah, even not the doubt of this is a bit flat, or so not even a question in a sense of am I not engaging in this the right way? Because the contentment means the absence of even that question. And it also comes down to personality. See, there's very different personalities. So liberation from attachment doesn't look one way in particular. There are those people that have much more peace aspect to their personality. There are those that are much more charismatic, those that are much more loving, and the same with someone that really enjoys being social, for example. Their freedom from a false idea of themselves isn't necessarily going to mean that they stop enjoying social interactions, whereas someone else might find themselves, very happy with solitude a lot of the time. Yes. Okay, this is a question that came in. It says, apart from the doer, there is also one strong belief of being a separate experiencer. So, for example, when emotional shock or physical pain comes into the body, I feel that the suffering starts automatically just with the presence of the emotional shock or physical pain. Guilt, blame come much later. So it seems like the problem for me is that I am the one who has to experience this. And this belief leads into suffering, like, why me? Or when will this go away? So I'd be happy if you can talk a little bit about this. So what is being spoken about, so the question is saying, well, apart from the doership aspect, where we blame the other for what they have done that has taken away my pleasure, or blaming myself, this person is saying that a lot of suffering comes from the strong belief that there is a separate experiencer that has to experience the pain in the flow of life, physical or emotional pain. And it sounds like the question is coming from maybe a belief that an individual experiencer who experiences pleasure or pain will dissolve. And so if we have this idea that there is an individual and this individual will one day dissolve, then what that means is that wrapped up in that idea, the idea that pleasure and pain will somehow dissolve because there won't be a me to experience it. And so I think what's being suggested here is that when the pain or pleasure is experienced as part of the flow of life, particularly the pain, that much before the blame comes in, there is this resistance to the pain itself, resistance to the pain being here. And so the resistance to the pain creates the idea, why me? When will this go away? And the fact is that the individual doer, or the individual experiencer, so the human, isn't what dissolves. It can dissolve from time to time in certain experiences just so that it shows us that actually life is an experience, and the human experience is exactly that. It's part of a bigger experience, which allows us to come to know ourselves as something grander than just a separate entity. At least we come to know ourselves as something connected to Source. But knowing that we're connected to Source doesn't actually bring the end of the individual experience. It doesn't bring that to an end. And it doesn't mean that the flow of life is not going to continue to be pleasure and pain. So this is really important to understand that we're always going to experience ourselves as this. That's what this life is meant to be. To experience life as a particular individual, not as some impersonal experience of life. And as part of the experience of being this particular individual, there's going to be the experience of pleasure and pain as part of the flow of life. Now, the freedom is from the attachment to the pleasure and pain. We're never going to be free from pleasure and pain. And so the issue that's being mentioned here, I feel victimized, why me? When is this going to end? That is attitudinal. That's based on someone's attitude to the flow of life, attitude to the pleasure and pain. And if we believe one of two things, either the pleasure or pain shouldn't be happening to me at some point in this enlightenment process, pleasure and pain won't be happening to an individual, then we can feel disappointed, frustrated when pain is there, thinking that, it hasn't happened yet. This freedom hasn't happened because I'm still experiencing pain. And if that's the idea, then we're going to continually wait for a time when life doesn't deliver pleasure or pain. And that means we're continually going to be frustrated with pleasure and pain when it's there because we have an idea that it will end. So to understand that this isn't about escaping pleasure or pain. It's about our attitude to it. And if we really understand that the flow of life is pleasure and pain, once we understand it, then this attitude of when will this end, why me, doesn't have a basis anymore. Because we wake up in the morning knowing that from the time we wake up, what we're going to experience is pleasure and pain. But the fact that the flow of life is pleasure and pain doesn't mean that our happiness, our peace, is at risk. So pleasure and pain is not an attack on our peace. It becomes an attack on our peace when there's an attitude that says it's an attack on our peace. So these ideas about pleasure and pain not being there, or ideas about pleasure and pain being something that adds or takes away from who I am, that's the issue. And where it can be exacerbated sometimes, this attitude that I need to be able to get away from pleasure and pain, as if some teachings, and this is not a criticism of the teaching because they're very valid teachings, but it's all teachings, this one as well, very much so. Whatever it puts forward as a concept or as a practice can be misinterpreted and turned into its own, it could turn into suffering. And there are some teachings that tell us to continually dissolve into the nothingness, for example, to allow sensation, even the sensation of pleasure and pain, to dissolve, and for suffering to be the formless awareness, let's say. And it's so valuable to do that, to be able to see that pleasure and pain and suffering can actually dissolve if we rest in being and really find ourselves unidentified with the body, which is a state that can happen. So a watching of the pleasure and the pain effectively means disidentifying from it, and we can see that in those states, because the subject essentially becomes something much more formless, much bigger than just the body. Even the physical sensation can tend to dissolve or become much weaker. And those practices are there not so much for us to ultimately be able to escape from pleasure and pain or suffering, but there to show the nature of the essence of the human being as formless awareness, and also there to be able to show that what we think is really solid and physical is not as real as it is, especially the suffering, the pleasure and pain. When we find ourselves in this sort of more expanded state of consciousness, the pleasure and pain will still be there, but it's the focus on it has dropped away. And when the focus on it drops away, then the intensity of it drops away. But a lot of the intensity is dropping away because our attitude of attachment to the pleasure and pain has fallen away when we tend to be in this witnessing state. And so actually what it's showing is that a lot of what the problem is in relation to pleasure and pain is not the pleasure and pain itself, but this added layer of intensification on top of the pleasure and pain. So an extra load on top of the basic pleasure and pain. And that load is always our attitude. So when we find ourselves opening up into a sort of a witnessing the pleasure, pain, and the suffering dissolves because it doesn't have the same ground on which to remain. And we might mistake that for the pleasure and pain becoming weaker. Actually, the base pleasure or pain are more or less the same. What's changed is this added load of suffering on the top. So once again, the way that I read that question is that the why me, when is this going to end, is once again another attitude to pleasure and pain. And just to clarify, so in the teaching, it says that the false belief of who we are is twofold. One, that we believe we are the doer, and that doership then means guilt, blame, and pride. Guilt for those actions that happen through me that deliver pain. Then I feel I have to blame myself. Blame towards the other for actions that happen through them, which I see as their actions, and so I have to hate them. And pride for my actions that deliver positive outcomes, that I say, look what I have achieved. But the second half is attachment to outcomes and expectation. The belief that my happiness is to be found in pleasure and the absence of pain. And so it's this belief that my happiness is to be found in the absence of pain or the presence of pleasure that is being referred to in this question, where it's like, apart from the guilt, blame, and pride which come after, there is a sense that I as a separate experiencer, and so that's what in the question is assumed to be the problem, I as a separate experiencer who experiences pleasure and pain. But actually it's this attitude that says my happiness is to be found in the absence of pain and the presence of pleasure. So even when we're thinking about, look at the spiritual teachings, and so let's see how the spiritual teachings can actually become the object of a new form of suffering, where let's say the old attachments to pleasure and pain and thinking are no longer such a big issue because we've found ourselves not engaging in certain things. And if we're not careful, we might find that our awareness doesn't land on the fact that the thinking has just taken on a different form. So really what is being pointed at here is that there's a whole lot of thinking, a whole lot of brain activity that keeps us from being. And so the end of guilt, blame, pride, worry and expectation really means the end of a whole lot of thinking. And when that thinking stops, it's very easy to just be. And what we can find is that because the concepts are being put forward, we find ourselves now thinking a whole lot about the concepts, thinking about the end of suffering, without realizing that this thinking about the end of suffering at some point goes past being useful and gets turned into obsessive thinking about expectation in the future. And so that thinking then essentially becomes the block, just like guilt, blame, pride, worry and expectation. So expectation about the end of suffering becomes a new form of thinking that prevents us from just being. So if we're lucky, awareness lands on the fact that we're continually waiting for peace of mind. And while we're waiting for peace of mind, we're not just necessarily waiting patiently, but we're working hard at, okay, so what do I have to do? What do I have to get next? What's missing? Because it's not here. And this thinking can carry on and carry on and carry on. And we might not realize that's the problem. So just understanding the principle of what's being spoken of, the principle that expectation is a problem, and we start off expecting, that we have the best job and all of the best material things, let's say, and then we substitute that oh no, that's not it, and we end up with these other expectations that don't get seen. And
isn't that better than the first way of being? Because at least this could be easy to drop later on.
Yeah, for that reason it's better, because it's less ingrained. But in a way it's sort of like being addicted to, I don't know, sugar instead of heroin. Yeah, it's better. But it's still an obstacle. And awareness just needs to land on this. That's it. Once it lands on it, it's over. Not necessarily in an instant. When awareness lands on it, it'll be over in that instant for maybe a minute or two. It'll probably come back, but it's not going to last forever now, because awareness has landed on the fact, wow, what was being passed as thinking that is holy, let's say, holy because it's about knowing oneself, and it gets recognized as being actually the same thing, like wolf in sheep's clothing. It's the same thinking of the thinking mind, waiting for something, and it gets recognized. So it means that its cover has been blown. And there's the same principle. There's lots of principles in spiritual seeking that can be. So the principles that are guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. Pride is a big one. If the process is taking you down a journey and there's lots of insights, at some point we might think, that we're the ones responsible for it. And a sense of superiority can creep in. And at some point we'll register, hopefully, awareness lands on the fact, oh, that is pride. And that in itself is meaning that we'll relate to people who haven't understood something, like, you know, you haven't got this? Huh. And then we could still feel pride and still say, oh yeah, but I understand that, you know, I didn't do it. I'm not the doer, you're not the doer, all of that. But deep down there's pride. And it's about these concepts going really deep to uproot any of these lurking habits that relate to the spiritual search. Can have guilt. I haven't got it. I'm useless. And blame to our friend who's got it, maybe. And essentially, at some point, the awareness lands on these different functions of the thinking mind, sees that it's just taken on a different subject to carry on the same principle of doership or attachment to outcomes. Which is why it's really often said, there's nowhere to go, nothing to achieve, no one is missing anything, nothing is really in the way of getting it right now. And having said that, I know that that means when we get it, and it happens right now, here. And it doesn't even happen, it also implies that it happens bang, like that. What it means is getting it right now is the instant when awareness lands on the fact that the brain is, the thinking is happening, saying, so what more do I have to do to get it? And when it lands on that and realizes stop, in that instant it's like, oh, there it is. Oh, there it is. But then I know that the habit that's still in place drag us back out into thinking. And it's a process of continually cutting, of that thinking being cut off. Where it becomes most tricky is when a certain type of thinking hasn't been identified yet as being one of those different forms of guilt, blame, pride, worry and expectation, and or where it hasn't been realized that what we are looking for is actually the quiet attitude to the flow of life. So it's not even about, really, it's not about sitting in a place where we feel this being. That's almost more of a practice when we drop into being and we sit there sort of meditating in being. Even that beingness tends to fall away. That experience of beingness. And when it falls away, as long as the attachments to outcomes have fallen away and the doership has fallen away, then we really just get to experience being very ordinary without even some sense of being, even without this experience of being, and simply the end of suffering. Meaning you wake up in the morning, you feel very much like you did before, actually. Going through your life doing, the things that you need to do, making breakfast, burning your hand on the hot kettle or something, pain in the moment, and that's it. It's pain in the moment. The thoughts, of guilt not arising, but not even this. I burnt my hand and I rest in being as a sensation. That's not it. That's not there either. So even this feeling of being, just like the experience of awareness. So there tends to be two aspects that gets recognized of self. So if we call self consciousness or self, the two aspects of self are the sense of being, sense of existence, which in meditation, if we sit in meditation, is the recognition of the undeniable sense of existence. The sense of existence doesn't tell us what exists. It doesn't say, oh, Roger, the body, this age and this gender exists. But in the space of awareness, or in the space of meditation, it's undeniable that I am. So I'm using the word I as an impersonal I. And that impersonal I is actually much closer to home than we might think. It's the I that is the base of I am Roger. I am Roger this body, I am Roger this body, a certain age. The core of that experience is this impersonal I. That in meditation, when we go to a very basic meditation of awareness of nothing, there are generally two aspects that are there in that very basic meditation. The undeniable sense of existence, and when we're being that, and there's the feedback of what it is, we find, wow, it doesn't tell us. There isn't an us there to know what it is. It doesn't have any real characters except for this undeniable sense of I am. The reason it says the word I am has been used is because it's a sense of existence. So if the thought arose in meditation, are you dead? There would not need to be any thinking about it because the undeniable sense of I am is there. So are you dead? The automatic answer to that question is no, I am. I am alive. I exist. So that's one aspect of self. And the other aspect of self is the awareness itself, the awareness function, the awareness aspect. So to me, they're the two sides of self, being and awareness. And they're like two facets. They're not really separate, but you can become aware of them, or awareness can become aware of the awareness aspect of self, and awareness can become aware of the being aspect of self, and it can be aware of them together simultaneously. And the reason for that awareness of it is so that there can be awareness of it in the waking state, in daily life, right here. And so that can start to happen when the state becomes much more expanded, and in that expanded state, we feel like we are the formless subject, that subject that has no real location, subject that pervades everything and that everything is made of. So that's where there's this strong sense of witnessing or being awareness. And at other times, we find that there's a very strong sense of being, or I am. And they start off in meditation, and then they happen in daily living, simply to show us that this is the core of the human being. Once it's really understood, these are the core of the human being, they dissolve. They stop being needed to be felt. So it's not even about feeling being. That can fall away. And Ramana Maharshi has some commentary on this, and it's in Sanskrit, the word for this phenomena when it happens the first time is aham sphurana, which is the bursting forth of I am. So when awareness becomes aware of I am, the I am of self, for the first time, it can be like a surprise. Oh, that's the I am that everyone's talking about. And when that happens, it effectively, the I am, the being, is like the primary object that awareness is aware of. And that can hang around for months, years. It hangs around, especially when we think it's all about being, having that experience of being. But actually, in the commentary, and it's my experience, is that I am, that's not the enlightened experience. And it too falls away. And so Ramana writes this, that bursting forth of I am, aham svarana, which really means awareness, becoming aware of the I am that has now presented itself. That is not the enlightened state. And that state too falls away. So what it falling away means that we end up not even necessarily experiencing being, not experiencing the opposite state of witnessing, formless awareness, which I don't know if there's a word for that form awareness, becoming aware of the awareness aspect of itself, but I suspect that if there's a word, it would be said that's not the enlightened state either, and both of those fall away. And what both of those falling away means, or would feel like, is coming back to being the individual, knowing that witnessing is happening, and knowing that one is grounded in being for a very simple reason. Not because you can feel them happening, but because you go through life and suffering doesn't happen. And so if you go through life and suffering doesn't happen, then you know that witnessing is happening. Witnessing basically means the flow of life is unfolding, pleasure sometimes, pain at others, and it's witnessed. Not in the original sense. In the original sense, it's a palpable witnessing by formless awareness. Now that's fallen away, but you can conclude, oh, witnessing is still happening because suffering isn't happening, attachment to pleasure or pain isn't there.
What would it feel like when? What would the process feel like when the thinking mind diminishes and the working mind sort of? What would the process feel like when the suffering mind, the thinking mind, becomes smaller, and the working space gets larger?
Mm-hmm. Well, the working mind won't get larger because the working mind is continually happening anyway. The thinking mind diminishing is the important part, because the thinking mind diminishing means less judgment of what's happening as right or wrong, and why is this happening to me, this shouldn't be happening, blaming the other and feeling guilt. All of that's in the thinking mind. So as that diminishes, there's basically a whole lot more space and
How
silence.
does it diminish? That's the question.
It diminishes as part of the story of life.
Can you elaborate?
It can happen through a magic flash.
Some more?
It could happen through life delivering new conditioning that undoes the existing conditioning. And when the existing conditioning is undone, then the thinking that stems from those old beliefs doesn't happen.
Yes.
So
this is
the
theory.
question, how does it happen?
Yeah.
Is really a clever way of saying, how can I do it? Right? And that's another example of how the doer grabs hold of the spiritual concept, and it becomes a new way of either resisting what is at the moment, or becomes a new form of obsessive thinking that gets in the way of just resting. So it's, if awareness really sees the different ways in which suffering arises, that it's a resistance to how things are, and the resistance is on the resistance that awareness can become aware of, that is most powerful, is when it sees the resistance on the thinking level. Right? So even if we don't introduce the new trick of the doer that says, so how can I bring suffering to an end? Right? Let's say that hasn't come in. If awareness becomes aware, it's awareness and the intellect, it's not just awareness. If awareness and the intellect that has now been started to be conditioned to start looking for these errors, if awareness sees, there's a habit that is continually commentating on what is going on. What's going on, what the others are doing, what I'm doing, what my experience of life is. And that commentating is the problem. When you really feel it, it's a relief from that commentating that we're looking for.
So would it be like the internal critic, sort of?
Sure. You can call it that.
Judging myself and judging the other, or being right and making the other wrong. So when does that fall away?
Especially when awareness and the intellect recognizes that that is the problem. Then it's at risk.
Theoretically, it's clear for 5 years that that's the problem. So, and it has become less. But I'm saying it is certainly become less. For example, yesterday I was walking and this man was honking, and normally sometimes I've even turned around and I've done this to cars. I mean, it's just happened. And yesterday there was this sense of, okay, it's his up-to-date conditioning and he wants to be that way, and there wasn't suffering in that moment. Normally there is a reaction, or there is a sort of a tenseness in the muscles, which is, I suppose, the uncomfortableness that you are talking about. So that didn't happen. And I'm sure there have been other incidents, but this is something I remember. It was near the Blue Diamond, and it stayed with me that the muscles didn't get tensed. Which normally happens literally every second, because there's a horn and the judger said, fuck you. And I said, okay, your deal, your trip. And somehow there was, body remained relaxed. So if this can happen more and more and more, then I know I'm there. So I'm saying, is there some
Well,
way
it's the same principle. The principle doesn't change. It's just that the principle, the understanding goes deeper and deeper. So, and even if you can recognize that the next time you go out and someone hoots the horn, you're not in control actually about whether the muscles tense and the judgment happens, right? It's potluck, in a sense. So if the muscles tense next time and the judgment happens, hopefully there's a part of you that is relaxed with that. Recognizing that that too, just like it's his genes and up-to-date conditioning to honk the horn, it's your genes and up-to-date conditioning to get tense from time to time, or your genes and up-to-date conditioning to not get tense, not in your control. And if you do that, that's not going to mean that you, by suddenly accepting what I've just, or going, oh, okay, that's fair. By saying that, that doesn't mean the doer says, well, if I do that, I'm going to get tense more often. Because it thinks that it is the one that is making you not get tense. It was completely the opposite. If you accept that from time to time you're going to get tense and other times you're not going to get tense, then that recognition is actually the doer letting go. The doer doesn't want to accept that you getting tense is not in your control, you getting tense is part of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. All it sees is the benefit of not getting tense, and so then it insists on you not getting tense when someone honks the horn. So when you do, if you do, which is based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning that you're not in control of, if you do, then that judger is going to get upset. It's going to go, oh, what's the point? 5 years and still I'm getting tense about the horns. Whereas the other attitude is one of peace with the fact that you got tense. Now that peace with the fact you got tense is actually the understanding going deeper.
So, if the muscle still gets tense, that's an uncomfortableness in the body. So how can there be peace in that moment?
There can be peace with the uncomfortableness. So there isn't peace on all levels, clearly, because there is the uncomfortableness on that physical level. But the question is, are you going to be at peace with that physical uncomfortableness, or are you going to be in resistance to the physical uncomfortableness? And clearly one is better than the other from a standpoint of peace of mind. So what we're saying is that there will be peace with the primary suffering. So the tension is the primary suffering, but now there is no secondary suffering. If you get angry with the primary suffering, that's primary suffering and secondary suffering. Even that, if it happens, not your doing. What it means is if there's primary suffering and no secondary suffering, we can look at it and go, there's more peace than if there is primary suffering and secondary suffering. Secondary suffering meaning your judgment of your initial judgment reaction. And also it's good to note that the body tension can be treated as a biological reaction, not as suffering. So the fact that you react even to the point where you turn around and hit a car, it can be useful to look at that as the biological reaction that happens in the moment. The psychological reaction is your attitude to that. And eventually it'll work its way all the way down so that you find even your biological reactions are changing.
By that you mean the actual tension of the muscle?
Yeah. But you can even, if awareness becomes aware of the tension, in that instant you can release the tension, which is not your doing. It's awareness becoming aware of the tension, and then tension relaxing. So dealing with this from both ends, the attitudinal end and also shifting the physiological side of things. When you recognize that the pattern, changing the pattern on the physiological side of things, which I have to keep saying, I'm talking as though you change it, but it's just the awareness of it, and then you relaxing. Keep it up. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I can tell there's a big difference from 5 years ago. So 5 years ago, there was an unusually strong sense of personal doership.
Yeah, I remember. Nobody else could speak.
Yeah, which means it was your destiny, the Pali's destiny, to have a very strong sense of personal doer, such that the notion that you are not the doer was very abrasive to your system, right? And as time goes on, I'm sure that there's an openness to see the beliefs in the body and the reactions of the body and actually draw your own conclusion and say, really, if I was in control, I choose not to tense up and feel so affected by the horn. The fact is, I'm not in control, that's why it keeps happening. And realizing that is, as far as I can see, the most effective thing for it to change. Insisting that I should be different, I should stop reacting, is not effective. It's actually more of the same problem.
But how come so many other people are not getting worked up with that on the road.
They different destiny, different makeup. So that's what I say is that if you look at your situation objectively, based on how you used to experience life, you could conclude, wow, I was given a very strong sense of personal doership. That's why the suffering that's why it was easier for you to stay in your room, let's say. Because there were less
Stimuli.
yeah, less things challenging you. So when you now find that you're able to run a household and enjoy certain pleasures, that is a result possibly of that sense of personal doership weakening a little bit, which means you're able to put up with more of daily life.
Yeah, but another way of looking at it is that the room was a cocoon and fairly stress-free. And since we're all above the poverty line, this is taking on the household seems a little bit unnecessary. I could continue staying in a hotel room for the rest of my life and not experience all these stimuli. So I also wonder if this is an unnecessary waste of energy that I've taken on.
Well, I think in this situation, the extra stimuli are those things that allow the growth to happen. They provide you with the opportunity to observe the automatic reactions happening. And then from there you can draw your own conclusions of, doership or non-doership.
Good.
Is it used to get details when awareness lands on the story which is told about the suffering? When awareness lands on suffering, is it used to get details about the story, or it's sufficient to that awareness lands on the sensations and that, and the sensation, or yes.
So what is the use of awareness landing on the sensations and on the thinking?
And not, yes, and I don't know how to say that. When there is suffering, sometimes it's about, a thought, about a belief. And so is it very important to see the belief, or just be with the sensation and see that it's suffering and not put word on it?
Well, both, I guess. If we're just with the sensation of suffering, it can dissolve. But and that can be one of the practices, not what I'm suggesting here, but it's valid in some teachings. They'll tell you to just be with it and see it dissolve. What tends not to happen when we just sit with it, it's very effective sometimes, but then it can become a technique where we want it to just dissolve all the time, the suffering. And at some point techniques stop working. And when we use this technique of just sitting with something and then watching it dissolve, what doesn't get addressed is the underlying belief, core belief, that the suffering actually stems from, or it doesn't get addressed particularly efficiently, which means suffering arises because the flow of life happens a certain way. The flow of life impacts our ingrained beliefs, and suffering arises. And then we see suffering, and we know that getting involved in the suffering is not good, and we've understood that what we are is formless awareness, let's say, and we can just witness, and the suffering dissolves. But when the suffering dissolves, we haven't addressed the initial belief that life impacted in order for the suffering to arise in the first place. So it's a combination of these techniques that is very powerful. One, rest back and just allow the suffering to dissolve in this space. The other is to actually look at the story and realize that it has doership, essentially, at the base of the story. So what that means is if the suffering is about something that someone hasn't done that they said they were going to do, and you're just feeling really uncomfortable, and then awareness lands on the thinking. Awareness lands on all the stories that you're telling everyone about what this person hasn't done. Can you believe this person? They said they were going to do this, and I'm here on holidays. They've just left my apartment. They haven't paid me the rent. They haven't done anything that we agreed on. And awareness then lands on the story, and at the bottom of the story, it realizes there's the pain of not getting the money that you require, the inconvenience, which can be very significant, but at the end of the day, it's pleasure or pain. And we can see the attachment to the pleasure or pain. We can see the blame for the other person based on doership. He should have done it differently. There's no seeing it as part of the story of life unfolding, not seeing it as my destiny. And so once awareness, it's not just awareness actually, it's awareness plus the intellect. On its own, awareness can't really awareness doesn't think. Awareness doesn't have any insights. It's the combination of awareness and the intelligent part of the intellect that recognizes what's being pointed at through the concepts, for example. In these concepts, it says all suffering is based on doership and attachment to outcome. So an event happened, someone has left the apartment, it hasn't paid what they said they were going to pay. And now there's a story going. Awareness lands on the fact that the story is attachment to outcomes and belief in personal doership. And so the suffering we will register is blame. Blame, feeling like I'm being the victim, maybe, and a whole lot of different combinations, whatever the combinations are. And so when awareness lands on it, it goes, wow, there it is, tick. Blame, attachment to outcomes, my destiny, their destiny.
And when the same schema repeats every time with the same suffering, it's difficult for me to get the root of this. Yes, I can see the suffering about expectation, and I can put words on it, but I want to take the roots of the same schema repeat again and again.
So the way that it can happen is one, we become aware of the story and become aware of what components are in the story, doership, attachment to outcome. We become aware of that time and time again. Then it means we really see the pattern, right, of what's repeating. Another thing that can be very useful is to not be this formless space in which the suffering just dissolves, right? Not use that technique. Not use the investigation that I'm just talking about becoming very aware of the doership and attachment to outcome. Let's say you've done both of those already. Now it could be time for you to feel the suffering fully, like to become completely unenlightened, right? Which is actually, when you do this consciously, you're quite enlightened. Where you feel it not from this open space point of view, but you really allow yourself to become the human with the feeling in the body. And get really angry or really sad, whatever the feeling is really telling you. So even beyond the thinking about what a bad person they are for having not paid you what they said they were going to pay you, but really feel it, like hate them, then you're starting to get to the root of the issue, because that's just the surface. So getting to the root, the root is going to be the same doership, attachment to outcome and blame, but at a much deeper level, stemming from a completely different event than this one. And the way that we get to the root is find the buoy. You know what a buoy is in the sea? Floats on the water around, for sailing boats to connect to. So it's a bit like the root is right at the bottom of the ocean, and there's a rope that comes from the root, which is at the bottom of the ocean, all the way up to the surface. And at the surface there's a buoy floating on the water. And all the way down there are more buoys until we get to the root at the bottom. And the feeling that you have about this particular suffering is the buoy on the surface. So you have to find the one that you're aware of. That's the one to start with. And if you so a buoy, it's spelt B-O-U-Y. So it means this thing that floats on water. And this is an analogy. So we have to find the one that we're aware of. And the one you're aware of is the feeling in your body at this point in time. And know that this feeling, this is just the buoy on the surface. And below it, there's another one. And below it, there's another one. And below it, there's another one. And eventually, there's the root. And how we get from one to the next is to go from the one that we are aware of. So you start in your body, and you don't do anything. Meaning, you don't create the story or anything. The feeling is the story. So the feeling, all you're doing is saying, I'm going to feel this. Well, not even feel it. You don't even say you're going to do it. Just allow the emotion to flower. And as you allow it to flower, what tends to happen is it shifts from being about this story to suddenly being about this story, the next one down. And then you realize, my uncomfortableness is not really so much to do with the guy who's left the apartment while you're on holiday. That, yes, but really it's much deeper. And that's how we get to it. And each time this energy is coming out, what's coming out is the belief in personal doership. So we need to become aware of what the belief of personal doership is in theory, and start to be aware of the belief in personal doership on the thinking level that we can become aware of. Then go to the feelings that we can become aware of, and see the belief in personal doership in the feelings, because at the bottom of a feeling, when we actually let it out, and we'll find there's a story in the feeling. And there's a story at the bottom of each feeling that is getting closer and closer to the root. And at the root, there is there'll be the story, and it will be personal doership again. Now, we don't really need to go and investigate all of the events that have happened in our life. There are just some that present themselves, and they're the ones that will allow us to see the root of doership. And once that's released, then all the others that grow off it get released with it. So we don't have to go in and process all of the events that have happened in our life. If we had to do that, we'd be here forever. It's really just about really becoming clear that the root of this is the belief in personal doership, and a lot of the belief in personal doership is contained so deeply in the body, and how that comes out, how that gets disbelieved is by that emotion coming out. But first, on a conscious level, on the way we see life consciously now, has to be one of non-doership. Otherwise, we feel these emotions, and we relate to them the same way as we did before. That no wonder I hate him, because this is what he did to me. Of course I hate him. So first we need to have come to see life and see the principle of non-doership on a conscious level. And then these deeply suppressed emotions can come out, and they can be witnessed. And with this understanding of life as a happening on a conscious level, then the deeply ingrained feelings are just allowed to leave, because they no longer are seen the same way. And even, we don't need to know too much about different techniques, and I generally speak just about the doership aspect, and then the feeling, the emotions, just happens. We find ourselves in a workshop or something where those things get triggered and have the space to come out. So the trick really is about starting to feel, asking the question like you did will give you an answer, but we don't need answers for everything. It's the process is very intelligent. We're not guiding what happens next, really. If we had to guide it, we'd mess it up day one. Yeah. So life is a happening according to God's will. If we can really surrender the fact that what I think needs to happen, what I feel I am doing that I need to do in order for things to keep unfolding, if we can surrender that part of our makeup, which is not us surrendering it, it's a realization, a recognition of the fact that maybe it's not at all true. Maybe this idea that I need to keep working very hard to keep everything on track, that I need to interfere with life, I need to have a strong opinion on what's going on in the world. When we realize maybe all of that's the problem. Because really, thy will be done. That's the key. And there's all sorts of arguments that the intellect, especially the intellect that hasn't realized, hasn't seen the benefit of surrender. There's all sorts of arguments that that intellect can put forward that says, no, you know, if you, thy will be done, and if you take on that, you're going to be complacent, you're going to not produce anything, you're not going to contribute anything to the world. And it's true, if thy will be done is taken on as a belief, then yes, it doesn't have the effect of freedom. But if it's not taken on as a belief, if it is really seen to be the antidote to a certain aspect of ourself that sees life completely the opposite. And so not taking on it as a new belief, but just dropping. And this is what allows us to actually then see the connection to Source. Because we drop, you know, if this aspect of ourself falls away, and then, as inevitably is the case, life continues to unfold actually much more smoothly, more efficiently, then we realize, so, wow, I've surrendered my doership, and yet in each moment I find myself willing and able to do what needs to happen next. And then it's like, so I'm a vehicle, I'm an experience, through a vehicle through which consciousness is functioning, and Roger is the final experience of a particular vehicle, particular body, mind, organism, and consciousness inhabiting that. And then it's like, so Rogerness, the Rogerness is a combination of Source and the body. So then Roger knows itself as always connected to Source. It doesn't exist except in connection to Source, which then means it sees everyone else connected to Source, meaning everyone is connected to Source. It's just that a self-recognition of that has to happen for peace, for oneself to be there. And it comes with surrender. Surrender can come through a giving up because life pushes us to the point where we give up. But giving up and surrender are a little different. Giving up is sort of out of frustration, and it can then lead to surrender. Surrender itself doesn't have to be a giving up in despair. But however it happens, giving up in despair is as good as any way of surrender happening. So if there is intense suffering, which is not everyone's experience, but if we have intense suffering, that can become the catalyst for us to really just give up, and hopefully give up in such a way that graceful surrender happens. So it's like, I can't do this on my own. I've tried to get rid of the suffering, I've tried everything, and I can't do it. It's just give up. And there's I won't do it justice probably now, but you can look it up. It's a little poster or something where someone sees footprints on a beach, and that they know that it's their footprints and the footprints of Jesus. So there's four feet, 2 sets of footprints, and then the person says, why is it that in my toughest times you abandon me? There's just 2 footprints. And the response was, actually, in those tough times, I was carrying you. So we couldn't do this on our own, for sure.
I think sometimes you said that it was a good thing not to know. But in my life, it's like suffering not to know, because I never know like what I want, sometimes what I feel, and it's suffering. So can you speak a bit more about this feeling not to know?
Yeah. So I think a lot of people exhibit a feeling of not being able to decide, not being able to feel which way to go, left or right. And that can create a lot of frustration. In fact, that's suffering. And the I don't know that I'm speaking about when I say that at a certain point I don't know is very helpful, is the I don't know that has recognized that the thinking of the thinking mind, and even the thinking of the working mind, is limited. That any thinking is coming from a very limited brain. I mean, when I say limited, it's a beautiful machine, but in the scheme of things, it's a very relative instrument, conditioned by very relative and limited circumstance and factors. And so we, at some point, realize I'm trying to figure out what I need. Let's say I'm trying to figure out how to solve the problems of life with my brain. And even we can look at, I'm trying to solve what I need just on a daily basis in terms of what food to eat or what decisions to make. And that's where I don't know, like on this level, my brain, my thinking can never really know, so stop trying. Stop insisting that I need to figure it out, I need to know. Because when we don't have a direction and it feels uncomfortable, then what we do is I need a direction. And that's the thinking mind kicking in with its idea of what the solution is. And so I don't know is an antidote to the thinking mind continually having its strategies as to how life should look and how life, when life is a certain way, everything will be okay. And also opinions on, the global state of affairs, opinions on this, that, and the other, continually thinking it's right, let's say, or knowing it's not right, and wanting to be right. All of this is the frustration of the mind, of the brain trying to understand something that at some point we go, I don't know. So it's the mind's realization, I can't know. Not I don't know, but I can't know. It's the intellect realizing its limitations. And that's surrender, actually. Because until that point, the intellect says, give me enough time and I'll figure this out. Or I'm going to make this happen for sure. I can do it. So I don't know is surrender. Maybe it should be I can't know. And I suspect that if we have certain experiences of life that are have been heavy experiences of life where we can't make decisions, let's say, and it's one of those things that then the surrender comes when it's really a surrender. It's a surrender where we really feel into we surrender to the feeling in the body of complete frustration, let's say. So at the same time as saying, I can't know, because we don't want it just to be like a mantra, oh, I can't know, that's not it. It's a real realization, I can't know. And then a collapse, in a sense, like collapse into the feeling of tiredness, of frustration that has been there and been managed to some extent for your whole life. And at this point, you can just collapse into it. And it's counterintuitive. The feeling of collapsing into that frustration, that tiredness, it feels like, no, that's the worst place to go. You know, you need to be strong, you need to keep. And at some point, that's the best place to go, to really feel, because there's the doership in there. In that case, it's the I can't do it, like I'm not good enough aspect, the guilt. But at the same time, the attachment to things being different. And if we can really drop into it and allow it to take over our body, those feelings, then they're feelings that have been suppressed for a long time. Because intuitively, it doesn't feel right to go there. It feels best to move in the opposite direction. But actually what I'm suggesting is that we've been doing that our whole life, and we could also say, I don't know that that's the right thing to do. To hide from, to move away from these feelings of complete give up. Because if these things just become mantras, words repeated, they're not powerful. If the concepts, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life, or I don't know, I can't know, if they just become mantras, it's not powerful. What the concepts are pointing at is for awareness to really see that. So there's the apple on the table, and so if I ask what is on the table, and previously I've said there's an apple on the table, there's an apple on the table, there's an apple on the table, and then I ask what's on the table, and someone says, oh, there's an apple on the table, right? That's not the answer, because that's just repeating the concept, there's an apple on the table. The concept, there's an apple on the table, wants you to see the apple on the table, and wants you to look at the apple on the table. And sometimes we're just happy with, we get told you're going to get asked what's on the table. There's an apple on the table, and we're satisfied with having this knowledge in the head. But it's actually not any good. It's not useful in and of itself. It's useful when we get the information that says there's an apple on the table. What it's saying, there's an apple on the table. Look at the apple on the table. See the apple on the table. Understand the apple on the table for yourself. I can never tell you what the apple on the table really looks like. I can tell you it's red and it has a stalk with 3 leaves on it, but that's not enough. You need to see the 3 leaves with all the details, and the stalk and the table and the apple and the worm coming out of the apple. Turn the apple around, taste the apple. And that's really all the concepts. If we don't look, which means see what the concepts are pointing at in daily life. And none of the concepts that are spoken about here, especially the ones that are talking about happiness in daily living and pointing at the doership, the non-doership, the attachment to outcomes, all those concepts are pointing right here, right now, into your daily life experience. And that means that you can investigate that while living life, while going to the shops, while being at work, while cooking dinner, while watching TV, especially in your interhuman relationships. Life actually is interhuman relationship. So we're looking for happiness in daily living, which really means happiness in interhuman relationships. And where our unhappiness in interhuman relationship comes from is from our guilt and blame in interhuman relationships. Guilt, blame and pride, where we see the other as the doer, ourself as the doer. And where we feel attached to pleasures such that we insist the other delivers everything we want, and we insist that we bring about everything we need, which is just not what life is. So we have to investigate the concepts for ourselves in daily living. Sure, if suffering isn't present, then I would say that you can conclude surrendering has happened. What we're surrendering is our will as a separate, the will that we believe we have as a separate independent entity. We believe there is a controller that is unaffected by anything else, and that's what I am. I am the chooser. And I can choose to go left or right. And the idea, the image of that controller is this me, whatever or maybe we just feel it as I, and it's believed to be this independent entity, something just independent basically means, not connected to anything else, not affected by anything else. When we investigate, we can't find this independent entity. All we find is a completely dependent biological entity that does all the choosing, does the acting in each moment. So when we look closely, we find, what actually does all the thinking and the choosing and the feeling is not this independent me that I thought existed, but this completely conditioned biological entity that is the way it is because of everything that has affected it previously, including the genetic structure that was originally put in place. And that can sound like this realization is terrible news. It's like, I've just realized that I don't exist as a free entity. But what happens is we've dissolved the identity that we think we are. And that dissolving of the identity that we think we are reveals the free entity that we really are. And that free entity is the consciousness of source that functions through the body, and the experience is the combination of the consciousness of source and the body. So that becomes the human experience. And even though the biological aspects are completely determined, the experience is an amazing experience, and the core, the essence of the experience knows that it is not bound by the experience. That when the experience comes to an end, and that's what it is, an experience, and it's been experienced for the sake of it, for the sake of experience, then that essence doesn't die with the experience. The essence returns back to source when the experience finishes. And knowing that consciously as part of the experience is the freedom. So we don't need freedom of the experience, we just need to know the freedom of the self, meaning the self that is never going to be affected by experience, even by death. And that's what the freedom in the experience is. So if suffering isn't arising, then there has been a surrender to God's will, meaning that the individual me has been seen to be a mistake. And nothing more, really. We would be living life without needing it to be different. Yeah, in my experience, there was a phase, a large phase, which was a very profound and exciting, revealing phase, where oneness was part of the experience of life, both in profound spiritual experience and also in terms of knowing myself to be formless awareness in which the daily life experience unfolded. That was mainly there to assist with the falling away of the false beliefs. Those experiences essentially, and when I say experiences, on the one hand, some of them were very short-lived, profound spiritual experiences, but other ones were more what you would say states of being, states of living, so different state of consciousness where there was much more of a oneness sense. And they can last for years, on and off and whatever. But ultimately, even those fall away because they're only useful at revealing the underlying nature of life. And once the underlying nature of life is seen, the false beliefs fall away. And then life can be lived in whichever state. It's not so important because the beliefs have fallen away. And if the beliefs can fall away without a oneness experience, without even certain states, then that's what's important. And if we look at the inclusion of the potential of past lives as being not my past life, but other lives that are linked to this experience. It could be that, so in my case, I had the oneness experience, but I can see that someone can have the end of suffering with no oneness experience. The false beliefs are dissolved, the false beliefs in doership are dissolved, and it could be explained by the fact that another life that happened before this, that is linked to this life, all of those profound experiences happened in that other life. And so when that life came to an end, the unresolved fears and desires, talents and insights from that life come into an incarnation now. So not the person, not a soul, but a bundle of data. So the person dies with the body, Roger dies with the body. Impersonal consciousness of source goes back to where it came from. And then a new incarnation comes into existence, and the data from a life that has ended becomes part of this, that person's up-to-date conditioning. And if that includes all of the insights of oneness, then I can't see why the beliefs of personal doership can't be dissolved without oneness experiences happening, let's say. Because in a sense they have happened. It's just that they haven't happened whereby this person in this life is aware of them. And if we become clear on the fact that actually what we're looking for is the end of suffering, not a oneness experience, not mystical states, then someone who maybe is seeking because they think that they're looking for special powers or certain states could actually realize, it's true. Actually, all I'm looking for, if I drop the idea that I'm looking for something else, which is just expectation, if I drop that idea, then actually it's true, my experience is I need nothing more. Assuming that that was the only thing in the way of their complete peace of mind. And then from that point on, who knows what life delivers? Dropping your expectation for something in the future definitely doesn't preclude you from getting it. If the story of life is to take you beyond peace of mind, which is more than enough for the individual, then so be it, but we don't even need to worry about it. So I think we've come to the end of our time. Thank you, everyone.